Hello, I'm Reverend Scott Wipperman, pastor here at First Presbyterian Church in Helena, Montana, and we welcome you to our worship service today. I'd like you to know that regardless of who you are or where you are in your journey of faith, you're welcome here at First Presbyterian Church. And our gospel reading today comes from Luke, from the 14th chapter. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come to you and say, "Give this man your seat." Then, humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite friends or your brothers or relatives or rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. And although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The word of the Lord. Well, a while back, there was a TV show called Columbo. Many of you may remember that. It was a detective series, but it was an inverted detective series because the scene always opened with the crime, and you saw who the perpetrator was. You knew who did it. And so the whole gist of the show was, would the person get away with it? And in comes this detective, this working class detective, very verbose but humble, a working man, always dressed in this rumpled overcoat over whatever humble clothes he was wearing, never designer things, much less sophisticated normally than the perpetrator of the crime in this particular episode. And he would talk a lot, and his common speech would normally be reassuring to the perpetrator in the beginning of the show, but by the end of the show, his persistent questions would normally be getting on the nerve of the perpetrator. And quite often you would get near the end of the show and it would be still a wonderment of, was this person going to get away with the crime, the murder usually they had committed? Because you weren't sure that Columbo had figured it out until he said, "Just one more thing." And that last question or that last thing made it clear that he knew exactly what had happened, and that this perpetrator was caught in his own trap. Now, the book of Hebrews that our first reading came from today, this is an interesting book. It's normally attributed as a Pauline epistle, but we don't really know who wrote it, because in this book, like many of Paul's letters in the introduction, there's no one claiming ownership. So we think it might be Paul, it could be Barabbas, it could be any number of people. But this letter is written, unlike the other Pauline epistles, which are written to the Gentiles. This is written to the Hebrews, to the Jews in Jerusalem, who are converted or considering converting to Christianity. And it's a wonderful treatise, not a theological treatise so much, but an affirmation for those who may be coming Christians, considering coming Christians, or maybe those who have become Christian but now are trying to live this kind of hybrid life between their old old Judaism and the practices they followed and these things that Jesus said and taught. Because quite often, while Jesus came to fulfill the law, many times the things he said turned upside down the practices and the traditions that were part of Judaism. And so people might be slipping back and forth between these two. And this is what the book of Hebrews is about. And at the end of this book, the author, Paul, whoever, gives us a series of moral exhortations. He tells us to love one another. He tells us to entertain strangers, because in the process, we might be entertaining angels. He tells us to remember those in prison. But not just remember those in prison. He goes on to qualify it, like we were one of their prisoners. So don't remember those in prison looking down upon them as those who had done wrong. Remember those in prisons like they're one of our fellow prisoners. And similarly, we are to remember those who have been mistreated. Once again, with the qualification of like we are one who is suffering. This is not remembering those who have been mistreated like let them eat cake. This is remember those who have been mistreated like we are one who are suffering, like we are one with them. He goes on and he tells us that, what is the next thing he tells us? Oh, yes, that we should honor marriage. Both those inside and outside of marriage, this is something that we should honor. And that he goes on that we are to stay free of the love of money. Any one of these can be a sermon in itself, right? There's lots we can say about these. And then he goes on to say, remember those religious leaders on whose shoulders you were standing, and imitate them. And that Christ is the same as he has been, as he is now, as he will be in the future. Our understanding of Christ and Christ's revelations may shift, just as was going on for these Hebrews that were moving from Judaism to Christianity. What Christ is telling us may shift, but Christ is the same. And then Paul goes, oh, and just one more thing. Do good and share with others, because this pleases God. It's interesting. It's not don't do bad and don't hoard. He's actually calling us to go out and act, do good, and share with others. Actually take the action of giving away and sharing. Whether that's said with the children, whether that be our candy or our money or our love or our attention, our recognition. And then in Luke, we get this interesting story. Jesus is invited to a prominent Pharisee's house for dinner. And they say that all those that are there are watching Jesus. They're watching to see if he's going to slip up, if he's going to make some kind of mistake. But Jesus, there's a lot of watching going on because Jesus is also noticing them. And in noticing them, he tells them this parable. And it's interesting. This doesn't sound like a parable, does it? Because parables are normally fictitious stories. They're stories that are made up to relay a number of points, a number of messages. That's the neat thing about a parable, is it's not just one thing. It's this layer upon layer upon layer of meaning in these parables. But this sounds much more like something out of Proverbs. Because he tells us how to properly behave at a dinner party, where to sit. And it's good advice. But it doesn't sound like a parable, does it? Now, think back on your own parties. When you get your family get-togethers, does everyone know where to sit? Is there any jockeying for positions at the tables? The bigger the family, probably the more fun this is, kind of thing. If there's just like two of you, it's not much of an issue. It's like when Bill Cosby one time was talking about parenthoods, and he was asking people if they were parents, and someone raised their hand, and he said, "How many kids do you have?" And they said, 2. And he said, "That counts. If you only have one kid, and when you come home and the vase is broken, you know who did it, So if you have a large family, there might be some jockeying for position at the table. Or how about business meetings that you might have been in, or community meetings? I know that when it's like the departmental meeting, normally the manager would come in and sit someplace, and everyone else just kind of plops down around the table. There's not too much concern about this, but if the meeting is with maybe a little bit larger range of hierarchy in the organization, then maybe there's a little bit more concern about where you sit. And after that meeting, when you go to dinner, where do I sit? Do I sit down here with my peers, or do I try to sit up here with these VPs? Because the stuff they're talking about up here will be really good, right? It'd be good to know that. If I'm sitting down here, we'll probably be talking about baseball and golf. But it'd be up here, we'd be hearing about the deals that are going on and the things that are important in these. And so while I'm not a VP, but it'd be nice to sit at this end of the table. Because the advice Jesus is giving here sounds great for, 0 AD, right? Because none of this, there wasn't any issue about importance or honor back then, or sitting up here and hearing these plans. But nowadays, we're told not to do this. It's all about self-promotion, right? We got to up ourselves a little bit here. And this just doesn't make any sense to sit at this low spot in the table and ask to be invited up. Who's going to invite us up? Everybody's worried about themselves and trying to get up there. No one's going to invite us up. So yeah, we may be overselling our status, our honor level a little bit by trying to edge up into one of the higher honor seats. It may not be completely true. It might be a little bit of a lie about us, but that's the way we move up in the world, right? This stuff that Jesus is talking about doesn't make any sense. It was good back then, but it just doesn't work now, right? And then Jesus goes on, and he says, just one more thing. When you throw a party, don't invite your brothers and your neighbors and other wealthy people. Don't invite those people who can pay you back by inviting you back to dinner. Invite those who can't invite you to dinner. They can't pay back. I bet with this first little saying, everyone was kind of going, "Whew, that's pretty easy. How to behave at dinner, I can do that. This is a nice thing." But then Jesus comes along with this point, this just one more thing. And boy, it's an immediate castigation of the very dinner he's at, right? Because there are probably no poor and no lame and no crippled at that dinner. He's there with a prominent Pharisee. There's probably other prominent people there at the dinner table with him. And he's saying this thing that is how none of us do dinner, right? Because when we throw a dinner party, we invite two types of people. We invite those people that we enjoy being with, and we invite those people that we don't enjoy being with. Let's take the ones we don't enjoy being with first here. We invite those people that always when we throw a party or have a dinner, there's those have-to invites, right? Your brother-in-law, other relatives, that if you don't invite them, there's going to be hell to pay afterwards for not inviting them to the party. And then there's some of those other people that you don't particularly enjoy, but you invite because these are the profitable invites. These are the people that you may not particularly like or enjoy being with, but maybe by inviting them to the party, there'll be some payback, some leverage, something you can get from them in the future that they can get in their good graces, and there'll be something that will fall back. But generally speaking, we invite people we enjoy being with for dinner and things like this. We invite people that we'd like to talk with and share things about and have a good time with. But to invite someone that we would enjoy being with, it means that we know that person. I mean, it's hard to know that we would enjoy being with someone without knowing them. So how many poor and crippled and lame and blind do we know that we can invite to dinner? Our society does such a great job of stratifying us all and separating us from people who are not like us. I had a friend, a lawyer, federal lawyer, who went to Washington, D.C. with her daughter. They were touring there, and she said that it was amazing that you could be at the Capitol and just a few blocks away was abject poverty, but you never had to see it because of the way the roads went and the way you would travel. You were separated from ever seeing that. So when we're able to invite someone that we would enjoy to dinner, we might actually have to know them. And so Jesus is speaking here, I think, about expanding maybe those who we know that we might be able to invite to dinner. So this is interesting. Paul gives us this series of affirmations, these moral platitudes that we should do. Jesus tells us this parable and gives us this line here. But when I read this, I really think that there's something else going on here. This isn't just a list of good things to do. That what is being talked about here in the way that we behave at a dinner party is much deeper and more important than that. It's not just a dinner party Jesus is talking about. This is life. How we view ourselves and position ourselves with others is how we should view and position ourselves with God. We should approach God with meekness and with humility. And with that same meekness and humility, we should approach others who are around us. Jesus is not telling us just one good thing. This, in fact, why Luke calls us a parable is because it's not just about dinner behavior. It's about life's behavior. This has a very literal meaning. Yes, it does make sense not to put yourself in an overt place of honor where you don't belong because you may be embarrassed. That's very true. But what Jesus is really talking about here is very metaphorical. There's many things underlying this. Like I said, the way that you position yourself to God should be meek and humble. And that should carry forward into the way that you interact with all others, with meekness and humility. In another letter, Paul tells us that we should look at others as better than ourselves. Not the thing society tells us to do, which is to always look at ourselves. And another interesting thing going on here, in every translation of the Bible that I could read about this scripture, it says in the beginning of the story about Jesus that they were watching Jesus, watching, but Jesus was noticing them, noticing. They were the same verbs in every translation, watching and noticing. They were watching to see if Jesus would slip up. Jesus was noticing them. Jesus was noticing them as he notices people throughout his ministry. Noticing Zacchaeus up in a tree. Noticing a woman who touches his robe. He notices what people need, what they need for healing, what they need for salvation. He notices people who can be used as builders of the kingdom. He's noticing. It's all about awareness, not about surveillance. And this is what Christ is calling us to as well. Notice the one who needs to be invited to dinner. Notice the one, be aware of the one who needs to be invited to a position of honor. Be aware. Don't watch. But be aware. Notice the people. So Christ, through these messages, is telling us that awareness is the way to live. Being aware of our surroundings and those with whom we're there, whom we're walking with in our surroundings. And do those things that Paul or the author writes about loving one another, and about remembering those that might be in prison or in hard times, and about entertaining strangers, because they just could be angels. Has that ever happened to you? Some stranger comes up, and later on you realize that was an angel I was talking to. So Jesus goes on with these stories. And then he says, but one more thing. Remember, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. But those who humble themselves, they will be exalted.